A camper van was driving at high speed as if someone is chasing it. When the van stopped, an old man with nothing on him but a pants and gas mask came out of it. Before he left, he took his wallet and a gun. He also took a farewell tape for his family before finally approaching the road and pointing his gun toward the incoming cars with sirens that seemed to be police cars. Back to 3 weeks ago, this is Walter White, the father of Walter White Jr. and the husband of Skylar White. Walter is a genius chemistry teacher with lots of Nobel Prizes awarded for his excellence in his field. Sadly, in the old age of 50, he often got sick. He even had to eat vegan meat to control his cholesterol level. Fortunately, his wife was a kind woman and very concerned about his health condition. Walter Jr. has suffered from brain paralysis since he was a child. That condition made it hard for him just to speak or move normally, so he needed a walking stick to help him to walk. Walter is a teacher at the same school where his son studied. He worked as a chemistry teacher there, but due to a lack of salary as a teacher, he had to work another job in a car wash. Unluckily for him, that day, one of his customers was his student at school, which indirectly humiliated him. However, Walter chose to remain silent and avoid any problems. When he got home, it turned out that the family had been waiting to give him a surprise for his 50th birthday. This surprise was attended by several friends and the sister of Skylar, named Marie Schrader, and her husband, Hank Schrader. Hank is a DEA agent, and because of his job, Walter Jr. admired him so much, in contrast to his father whom he had no respect for at all. Unfortunately, because he felt superior, Hank even dared to make fun of Walter and humiliate him in front of his son and wife. The next day, when Walter was at work, he suddenly fell unconscious. He was then rushed to the hospital by ambulance. When the doctor asked about the symptoms, he admitted that he only had a mild cough due to lack of breakfast that morning, but after further examination by the doctor, it turned out that Walter suffered from inoperable late-stage lung cancer and his chances of life were only for a few more years. When he got home, Walter didn't immediately tell his wife about his condition. He acted passive, just like usual, as if nothing had happened, until the next day, Walter, who kept daydreaming, received a reprimand from his boss, but who knows what got into him that afternoon. He cursed and scolded his boss. He even went further and resigned that very day. While daydreaming in his yard, Hank suddenly called and offered him a job. Walter was asked to examine a drug lab in the next raid operation. The next day, while carrying out the operation, Walter saw one of the targets escape through a window. Somehow, Walter actually recognized that person. At night, Walter came to see the escaped raid target. It turned out that he was a former student at his school. His name is Jesse Pinkman. Walter asked him about what happened that afternoon, but Jesse acted like he didn't know anything. Walter knew that Jesse was a drug dealer, and without further ado, Walter offered to become his partner in crime, because according to Walter, he was a genius in chemistry, while Jesse was an expert in sales, and with both of them working together, they would get a lot of money in no time. Jesse was surprised to hear those words came from a geeky-faced teacher. He didn't take it seriously at first and even laughed at it, but Walter was not joking. He threatened to turn him into the police if he refused to work with him. The next day, Walter stole several chemistry tools from school and took them to Jesse's house. Walter explained the function of each of the tools, but Jesse didn't seem to care at all. He even denied that Walter's theory would be less handy than his experience in meth cooking. He thought that a school teacher would not be better at cooking meth than a dealer like him. But instead, Walter thought that Jesse's meth was nothing more than a failure. Long story short, they agreed to buy a camper van. They then used the van as a moving lab for them to cook the meth. The next day, Walter accompanied his son to shop for clothes when suddenly, a group of teenagers showed up and bullied Walter Jr. for his disability. Somehow, out of nowhere, as if something possessed him, Walter rampaged and managed to drive the bullies away. That incident shocked his wife and son. A very timid person suddenly stood up and fight. First day operation finally began as Walter and Jesse took the van to the middle of nowhere. Walter took off his clothes and left with his underpants, which made Jesse confused by his behavior before entering the lab. It turned out that it was intended to prevent his clothes from being contaminated with chemical particles. Walter's method of cooking the meth was way different from what Jesse usually did, and after they finished cooking their first batch, Jesse was left impressed. The pure clear crystal of meth that Walter just made was the clearest and the biggest he ever seen in his entire life. Walter didn't care about the praise because all he wanted was to get a lot of money in a short time. The next day, Jesse, who worked as a dealer for them, immediately asked a friend to sell their products. He came to Domingo, one of his friends who had a lot of links to distributing the drugs. He is Emilio's cousin, Jesse's former partner who was previously arrested during Hank's raid operation. After 2 weeks of staying at the prison, he had been bailed out of prison and had a grudge against Jesse. They detained Jesse at his house. Jesse was asked to confess where he got the meth. Cornered, he finally leaked the information. The arrival of these two strangers certainly made Walter confused. Moreover, Emilio recognized Walter's face, who was at the crime scene when he was arrested. This made the situation worse. They tried to escape but to no avail. He had no other option but to negotiate to save his life. He offered both of them his meth's secret formula. Long story short, the deal was made. Full of doubts, Walter started to cook to show them his formula. There was tension because Walter deliberately slowed down each step, until finally, Walter had finished making a crystal which turned out to be explosive. He detonated the toxic compound and immediately got out of the van. The compound immediately reacted with respiratory organs as a toxic that could cause death with just one inhalation. The explosive also sparked a fire that started to get bigger and burnt the grass around there. Walter immediately dragged Jesse and put on an anti-poison mask on him. He then immediately left that place. The scene back to the beginning of the film where Walter stood in the middle of the road and pointed his gun toward the oncoming cars. He initially thought that the incoming sirens were from some police cars who came to arrest him, but it turned out to be a group of fire trucks on the rescue to extinguish the fire from the fire sparks before. The next morning, Walter was having breakfast with his family when a person claimed to be from a network provider called him. Walter knew that it was Jesse. He was so pissed off because Jesse dared to call him through his home telephone number. House. Turned out, Jesse had bad news for him. Somehow, one of the men they locked in the van was still alive. It turned out that the chemical was not strong enough to kill both of them. He immediately went to Jesse's house to see it by himself, but before heading there, he visited the school and took a strong acid fluid from there. Domingo had freed himself from the van and escaped from there limply. Thankfully, Walter, who was on his way to Jesse's house, saw him. He immediately caught him and put him in his car trunk. After he arrived and saw everything, he argued with Jesse about everything that had happened. The relationship between Jesse and Walter got worse thanks to that. They blamed each other for the mess they made. Moreover, Jesse's ego made the situation even worse. The choice to let go of Domingo was not a good idea. Moreover, with the death of Emilio, Domingo's cousin, it was certain that he would revenge on them and finish off their family if he was freed. But after all, Emilio's dead body would soon develop an unpleasant aroma, so they had to get rid of it as soon as possible. Walter then suggested dissolving the body in strong acid. Upon hearing that, Jesse was shocked. Long story short, Jesse agreed with Walter's idea, which was to destroy his body with a chemical liquid so that it dissolved without a trace. None of them wanted to do the job and they ended up with a coin toss to decide who would do it. Jesse was chosen as the person who would dissolve Emilio's corpse. Meanwhile, Walter had to kill Domingo. Jesse immediately looked for all the necessary tools because the poisonous acid liquid needed a special plastic as a container. Meanwhile, Skylar's suspicions made her trace the number that had called Walter this morning. Skylar was flabbergasted when she found out that the number belonged to a drug addict and dealer, Jesse. At the same time, Walter visited Domingo, whom they chained in Jesse's basement, but instead of killing him, Walter gave him food and drink. He cursed himself for his cowardly action because he had no courage to kill Domingo. As if that wasn't enough, he rolled the pot that was on the table and smoked it. The next day, Walter accompanied his wife to check on the condition of their baby. The doctor said that Skylar would give birth to a baby girl. This certainly made them very happy, but before leaving that place, Skylar asked Walter about Jesse Pinkman because she had found out about him. Walter knew that he couldn't cover up anything anymore. He admitted that he had indeed bought some pots from Jesse to calm his mind. Skylar obviously could not accept that answer because his own brother-in-law was a DEA agent, but somehow, Walter asked his wife to respect his decision. The next day, while teaching in the class, Walter had a hallucination, but luckily, he was able to handle the situation. At the same time, Jesse had started to dissolve the corpse and was moving it out of the van when suddenly, Skylar came and barged into his house. Skylar threatened to throw him in jail if he still sells pots to her husband. Knowing that he was in an unfavorable situation, Jesse couldn't say anything in defense. He just looked down and hoped that this way, Skylar will leave him. A moment before Skylar left, she smelled the unpleasant smell, but luckily, she didn't suspect anything and immediately left Jesse. After that, Jesse began the process of dissolving Emilio's dead body with acid. Not long after that, Walter came. Jesse told Walter that he had finished his job. Emilio's corpse had been soaked with the acid in the bathtub. Walter couldn't help but be shocked to hear that Jesse used a bathtub to do the job instead of the special plastic container that he told him to use. They immediately headed towards the bathroom, but before they got there, the acid had been leaking through the roof from the second floor, and suddenly, the whole roof and parts of the bathtub, including the half-dissolved dead body, came out of the roof. The acid dissolved everything so badly that it destroyed the building underneath. Walter asked him to buy a plastic tub because the acid solution couldn't penetrate it, but he didn't do what was told, and that happened. Jesse finally learned his lesson. While cleaning up the rest of the mess, Walter briefly remembered his youth when he was still learning chemistry with a woman, but over time, he felt nauseous. Turned out, even though he had used a gas mask, he could still inhale the smell of the acid and the rotten body, which made him cough so hard. Things got worse when Walter found out that Jesse had been consuming the crystal meth that was supposed to be sold. Walter always said that they only cook it and not consume it, but Jesse refused the order. He brought up Walter's unfinished problem with Domingo and made it an excuse for his mistakes. Walter couldn't say anything but stopped complaining. For Walter, murder is the biggest violation of his morals and life principles. By murdering, many aspects are violated. He knew that if he let Domingo away, there is only be one thing that would happen. He would kill all his family, including himself. That turmoil is what kept him stalling and stalling for time. Meanwhile, his relationship and Skylar were also getting worse. The changes in Walter's behavior were really hard for her to accept. Walter often disappeared unnoticed, came home late, and had no reason for what he was doing. That made Skylar feel that Walter was hiding something from her. In the evening, Walter once again made dinner for Domingo. He removed the crust on the sides of the bread, just like Domingo did yesterday. Judging by that, not only that he feeds him, but he was also really willing to do it. Walter coughed while walking on the stairs to the basement, showing that his coughing had gotten worse. Just before he was about to hand over the plate, his cough sent him unconscious, making him drop the plate to the floor into pieces. 15 minutes later, Walter came back to his consciousness. He immediately cleaned up the broken plate and returned to make another sandwich for Domingo. After giving it, the two of them chatted. Walter admitted that he had suffered from lung cancer